Hello, hello. I'm Casey,
And I'm Fallon.
and this is
Render the Darkness.
Check out our new gear. I know the people who are listening can't see if you're not on YouTube. We have new hats with our logos and our pictures if you would like to see them.
We have hats.
We have hats and hoodies and shirts. So please feel free to go to our YouTube and check them out visually if you have not. Not sponsored.
Yeah.
My beautiful singing voice.
Oh.
Also, just for the record, I'm wearing this hat in this recording to sport the new gear, but you will not see me wearing a whole lot of hats. I hate hats. So, but just know that if I was gonna own a hat, which I do own this hat, and I was gonna wear a hat, it would be this Render the Darkness hat. So if you too would like to wear one of these hats, just let us know, and we will see what we can do to make that happen. Just kidding. I'm not gonna send you my hat.
If you haven't noticed, I always wear hats.
She always wears a hat.
This
So
one's going to be blue.
when we were doing the gear, she insisted on hats. I'm sure there's a lot of people out in the world who love hats. I'm not one of them. So after this episode, you'll probably not see me in too many more hats. Anyway. Alright, today I'm going to be talking about the case of Kitty Genovese. I personally had never heard of this case, which, if you remember, I did mention her briefly in. Did I say that right? Briefly.
Briefly.
I felt like I said that wrong. I did mention her briefly in a previous episode. I believe it was the Friday the 13th episode that I mentioned her in, and said I was going to do a case on her. So that is what I'm going to be doing today. The fact for this episode is that dead skin cells are the main component in household dust.
That's nasty.
Chris and I actually just talked. Chris is my husband. I don't think I've mentioned that's his name before. Anyway, Chris and I actually just talked about this, so I kind of already fact checked it before I used it as a fact. So it is true.
It's still nasty.
Okay, so an important thing to remember before I get into this case about the case is the time period in which it happened. This was before 911 was a thing. Okay. So keep that in mind as I go over the information of this case. Catherine Susan Genovese, who was lovingly called by her friends for as far back as most people can remember, Kitty, which is what I'll be referring to her as through most of this case, because that was what she preferred to be called.
Okay.
She was born July 7th, 1935, in Brooklyn, New York, in Kings County, to parents Vincent and Rachel Marie Genovese. She was the oldest of 5 children. She had 3 brothers and 1 sister. Their names were William, also known as Bill, Frank, Vincent Jr., and Susan. As a child, Kitty was known for having just a huge spark for life. She was energetic, she was outgoing and enthusiastic. Her friends and family would describe her as a chatterbox, and she was always extremely popular growing up. She was charismatic, people flocked to her, and she loved people just as much as they typically loved her. She loved music and was considered very beautiful, which I looked up and have seen pictures of her, and she was absolutely stunning. She had such a fun personality that in 1953, she was voted the class cut-up by her graduating class.
Oh.
This was at an all-girls school in Prospect Heights. There were 712 girls in that class. So that just goes to show how loved she was, even in high school.
That's a lot of girls in one class.
Was. Her family would go on to move to New Canaan, Connecticut, but Kitty decided to stay in New York. At the time, she was planning to be wed. I couldn't find the name of her husband because it said that the marriage was very short-lived and neither party spoke much of the marriage after it was annulled. She did try to live with her parents for a short period of time in New Canaan after her marriage was annulled, but she said she loved New York too much to leave, so she moved back. However, she remained very actively involved in her family's lives. She went to visit them nearly every weekend. Um, and she was a good sister too. She really, really was devoted to her siblings and staying current in their lives and keeping them current in what was going on. She was very well read and educated.
That's good.
She held several different job titles before she found a job as the bar manager at a place called Ev's 11th Hour Tavern, which was located in Hollis, Queens. Her lifelong dream was to one day open her own Italian restaurant.
Ooh, so she could cook.
Mm-hmm. She had a passion. Because of that dream, she would often work a lot of double shifts in an effort to save money, and she made really good money for the time. I read on biography.com that she made $750 a month. So that translated to today's money would be about $8,000 a month.
Dang, get it, girl.
Mm-hmm. For a woman in that time, especially.
Yeah.
At this point, this was in the 60s. So.
Okay.
On March 13th, 1963, Kitty would meet the love of her life, Mary Ann Zelenko. Hopefully I said that right. And the couple would move in together. They settled on an apartment in Kew Gardens, which was in Queens, New York. The apartment was next to the Long Island Rail Station. The apartment was on the second floor and was one of the 14 units in the complex. The apartments were located above storefronts. There was like a drugstore and a coffee shop.
Okay, so it was like.
So yeah, it was like the floor of the apartments was all different department stores or different things like that, businesses, and then above that was the apartments.
Okay, I got you. Kind of like the laundromat is in town, like the apartments and the laundromat.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of different areas throughout New York that are still set up that way to this day.
Yeah, save space, stack more and more and more.
Yep. On March 13th, 1964, so Kitty and Marianne's 1-year anniversary, Kitty left work at around 3 a.m. Once she arrived back at the apartment, she parked next to the rail station, then began towards her home. Unbeknownst to her, there was a monster lurking in the dark, waiting for her. It would come to light that that monster's name was Winston Mosley, who was 28 years old at the time, who had been out driving around the Queens area looking for a victim. He had seen Kitty getting into her vehicle when she was leaving the bar. He would unfortunately follow her home with his hunting knife in tow.
Oh gosh, so he already had it on his mind.
Oh yeah, that's what he went out for that night. He went out to find a victim. He lived close to the location. Not only that, but he was married with 3 kids of his own, and one he and his wife were raising that was actually one of his wife's cousin's sons, who the couple had been raising and planned to adopt. Of the 4 children, from what I understand, only 2 of them actually lived with the couple. Their one biological son and the son of the cousin, because his first wife had custody of the other 2 boys.
Okay.
And they had 5 dogs.
Puppies.
I think I read they were German Shepherds.
Ooh.
He and his wife worked opposite shifts from one another, which meant they weren't often together. She worked the night shift as a registered nurse at a hospital, and Mosley worked 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. at a place called the Ray Graham Corporation, and often worked evening hours for his father at his father's TV repair shop. Shortly after Kitty exited her vehicle and began walking towards her apartment, Mosley would make his monstrous move. In the chase, Kitty had managed to make it to Austin Street, which was the opposite direction from which she initially began trying to flee from her soon-to-be attacker. Once she made it to the corner of Austin Street, she began to scream over and over, "Help! Help!" She continued to run down Austin Street towards Lefferts Boulevard. Of all the businesses located in that area, there would have only been one that could possibly be open at 3:20 in the morning, and that was a bar. It was called Austin Bar and Grill, which is believed to be where she was headed. But Again, unbeknownst to her, they had actually closed early that night.
Oh no.
Yeah. She was only 4 doors away from it when he ran up behind her, chased her down, and proceeded to stab her.
Oh gosh.
She immediately screamed and began yelling out again for help, exclaiming, "Oh God, I've been stabbed. He stabbed me. Help me. Somebody, please help me."
That's horrible. Poor girl.
Yeah, it gets worse. Yeah, sorry. That's a warning. It gets worse. Despite the time being between 3 and 4 a.m., which was typically quiet due to most of the residents being asleep at this hour, there were actually a lot of witnesses to this first attack. Some that seen it happen and some that heard the attack taking place. It would be discovered later that there was a young woman watching the attack from a window who thought the man was beating Kitty. There was another man who yelled out the window saying, "Shut the fuck up." Another man yelled out to ask what's going on down there. Light after light began to turn on in the apartment building located just where the attack took place, as more and more people were being woken by the commotion. Kitty's neighbor, Robert Moser, saw the attack happening and began yelling, "Leave that girl alone." Moser's yelling did cause Mosley to retreat back to his vehicle, but he didn't leave. Several people saw him flee, and some even saw him get into his car. Mosley waited and watched to see if the police were going to come.
So did anybody call? Did anybody call the police, or like try to help her, or like?
We'll get into that. We're about to get into that right now. Meanwhile, Kitty was still alive, and instead of anyone rushing to help her, some simply went back to bed.
Oh my god.
Others watched from their windows as Kitty struggled while crying and yelling, "Help! If somebody doesn't help me, I'm going to die." With no one coming to her aid, Kitty struggled to get back on her feet and stagger back towards her apartment direction. It was noted that people were still simply watching the woman. They watched her whole struggle journey, even later giving different recountings of how Kitty was walking. Some saying she was staggering, some saying she was in a slow pace, but all of the retellings of what they witnessed was her struggling to move forward.
And nobody went out there to help her. Nothing.
So,
that's pretty crappy.
Yeah, it really is. This whole case is just heartbreaking and just horrific. Unfortunately, she had been stabbed in her lungs, so she was struggling to breathe. She was slowly making it there. It would later be verified that at this point, a man and his wife were watching Kitty barely stagger to the rear walkway, and they weren't the only ones watching. Several other would later concur with the husband and wife as to Kitty's state in this moment. The husband and wife would go on to say, Kitty began yelling out again, "I'm dying, I'm dying." She did make it into her apartment building, but sadly she would collapse at the bottom of the stairs. And I said her apartment building. Technically, it was her apartment building, but it wasn't her side of the apartment building.
Oh,
okay. Once she collapsed, she began yelling out for help from one of her friends who lived in an apartment located on the top of the stairs that she could not climb. She began yelling, Carl, help me, I'm stabbed." Carl did hear her. This prompted him to call a friend of his who was in Nassau County for advice on what to do. The friend told him to call the police. He then heard Kitty again. This time she yelled, "Carl, it's Kitty. I've been stabbed. Help me." Panicked on what to do, after hanging up with his friend, instead of calling the police like she had advised him to do, Carl would climb onto the roof and scurry over to another woman's apartment. Once he announced his identity, she opened the window. They could hear Kitty crying. They heard Kitty again yell, "Help me, it's Kitty." That's when they decided to try to contact a neighbor of Kitty's. Her name was Sophie. Carl thought that she could come identify the girl and verify whether or not it really was Kitty. When the neighbor explained to him she didn't know Sophie, nor did she have a way to contact her, he replied by saying, quote, I don't want to get involved. I want somebody else to come over and see if it is really Kitty. I think she's drunk. End quote.
Oh, no.
She then gave him the number for another neighbor named Greta Schwartz. Once Carl left, the woman explained to her husband what Carl said about a woman crying out in Carl's hallway. She asked her husband if she could go down to the police call box located on Austin Street and Lefferts Boulevard to get help for the woman, and the husband told her no.
Why is nobody helping this poor woman? I don't understand. And what gives him the right to tell his wife, no, she can't do something?
Well, I mean, I think most husbands would say no in that situation because obviously there's an attacker. Obviously something is going on out there, and you're not going to send a woman, your wife in the 60s, in the dark by herself.
That makes sense.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that he was right or wrong for telling her no. I'm just saying I can understand the reasoning for not wanting her to go out on the streets by herself. I'm not sure he should have said no. I mean, I would think that it would be a more
maybe he didn't
plausible
say no.
thing to do. No, I mean, it said he said no, and he verified that he said no. But I think it would have been a more sensible thing for him to say, let's both go down to the police call box, or let me do it, or something. But he didn't. Instead, he just said no. And everyone remained in the apartment. But Mosley wanted the chance to finish his job. And once he was confident it was safe for him to do so, he would track Kitty down. The husband and wife who had watched Kitty, they were still watching. The husband told the wife he was going to call the police, but she told him not to, claiming 30 people must have called by now. So he didn't. Once he found her, Kitty would let out her last two desperate cries, yelling, help, help. Mosley would sadly stab her in her throat first so she couldn't scream anymore.
Oh my gosh.
He then
went back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he wanted to finish what he'd started. He then stabbed her, after he stabbed her in the throat so she couldn't scream, he then stabbed her more and more. And when he was through stabbing her, he would brutally R-word her, sexually assault her. Once he was finished, he would take what money Kitty had on her, which I read was around $49, and he would leave. Kitty was barely clinging on to life, but she was still alive. Another neighbor by the name of Sophie Ferrer had heard the commotion and went to investigate. That's when she found Kitty. She began holding her and trying to comfort her. And there's more to that story, which I'm fixing to get into in just a moment. So by this point, Carl had called Greta and was trying to explain everything to her, but she struggled to piece together what he was telling her because she was asleep through the whole thing. She didn't hear anything. So the first thing she knew about it was the phone call from Carl. Okay. But Greta did actually know who Kitty was, so she told Carl she was heading over, and she did. When attempting to open the door to the entrance she needed to go through to get to Carl's apartment, it was blocked. This was when Greta had realized it was Kitty blocking the door. By this point, Mosley had fled the scene. In this moment, Kitty was still alive, but Greta, in a state of shock and panic, fled the hallway. Greta would then call Sophie, who had actually been woken up by the first screams but couldn't see anything from her window, that's why she hadn't left her apartment yet. But once Greta had confirmed to Sophie what was going on, Sophie and Greta then met in another hallway to run to Kitty's side to try to help her. Okay. Sophie quickly scooped Kitty up into her arms and began trying to comfort her. Finally, Carl stepped out into the hallway and Sophie instructed him to call the police, which he did. It was around 3:50 a.m.
And when did the attack happen?
Around 3:10, 3:20. Quickly, Peter Volber, a New York City police detective, New York Police Department patrolman, and an ambulance would arrive literally 2 minutes later. Shortly after that, 2 more detectives would show up. Detective Mitchell Sang and Detective Bruno Poxtis, Kitty was actually still alive even then, so they would dispatch an ambulance for her. But unfortunately, Kitty would pass away from her injuries in the ambulance on the way to Queens General Hospital at 4:30 a.m. Which I didn't put it in here, but I do want to note also that at this particular point in time, um, calling an ambulance wasn't the same then as it is now. You know, when you call an ambulance now, they have the means and the ability to start performing life-saving procedures immediately. At this point, an ambulance was literally only used for transport. They had nothing short of a first aid kit you could buy from Walmart in there. They had no way to help at all other than getting them from the scene of the crime to the hospital.
Okay.
At that time. Detective Bernard Jacobs arrived at the scene soon after. He began questioning everyone not only in the building Kitty was found in, but also the apartment building located where the first attack took place. Marianne was called. If you remember Marianne, that was Kitty's partner and or roommate. Marianne was called to identify Kitty's body, and she did confirm it to be her. The coroner's report would go on to say that Kitty had a total of 13 different stab wounds, coupled with several defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought her attacker with everything she had. It was determined that the stab wounds themselves weren't fatal, but what actually killed her were the puncture wounds to her lungs, which basically caused her lungs to slowly fill her chest cavity with air, so she was essentially suffocating to death. It was determined that it took well over an hour for Kitty to die.
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. Ugh.
Once Marianne and Detective Sang, which is who drove her to the hospital, once they had returned back to Marianne and Kitty's apartment, he began asking her questions about Kitty. But Marianne, in a clear state of shock, it was really hard to question her. She was having a difficult time.
Yeah,
and it was made even harder by the fact that Carl Ross was present. If you remember him, he's the guy who climbed across the roof, called a friend, did all these other steps before calling the police.
Yeah,
He had pretty much been present everywhere in the investigation so far, which was making detectives pretty suspicious of him. And not only suspicious, but frustrated as well. Detective Sang even asked Carl to leave so he could ask Marianne questions without him there, but Carl refused to go. He essentially told the detective that it was Marianne's apartment, and if she wanted him to leave, he would, but otherwise he was staying.
So he didn't want nothing to do with it when it happened, but now he wants to be like right in the middle of it.
Correct.
Okay.
There's a reason for that, and I'll get into that. This prompted Sang to escort Carl out physically, which caused Carl to begin screaming profanities from outside the door. And then the detective heard a loud noise from the hallway. When he looked to see what it was, he discovered Carl had kicked in a panel of the street door.
Oh.
That's when Detective Sang cuffed Carl and took him to the precinct under the charge of disorderly conduct.
Don't blame him.
What Detective Sang didn't and couldn't have known was that Carl was adamant to protect Marianne because he too was gay, and he was worried about what would happen if she let it slip to the cops that her and Kitty were actually partners and not roommates. Remember, at this point in time in history, being a homosexual was not acceptable.
Okay.
So, as stubborn as he seemed to be being, I think he genuinely was trying to be a good friend.
Okay.
In fact, once he got to see the judge and pay his fine, he rushed back to Marianne's apartment as fast as he could. I read that Carl also had received a 5-day suspended jail sentence for his disorderly conduct as well.
Okay.
Even more sadly for Marianne, she attempted to call in that day, but was told if she didn't come in, she would be fired. Obviously, in a state of shock and grief, she didn't go in, and she did in fact get fired.
Wow, that's really shitty.
So she lost her job and the love of her life that day. The main area of focus as far as finding witnesses was the tutor and the Mowbray apartments because of their locations in contrast to the location of both the attacks. The police attained a list of all the occupants in the buildings and began interviewing. I think one of the most concerning things about the investigation for the detectives was just how many people heard or seen the attack play out and did nothing to intervene or help at all. They would go to report, in their initial report, at least 12 people who would openly say that they saw or heard the attack and did nothing. There's far more people who saw and heard the attack, but 12 who openly admitted that they did nothing.
Right.
There was only a few people who actually did attempt to do anything from what they knew at this point. The ones who yelled, a family who did attempt to call the police, but the call was reported as a domestic dispute, so the police didn't come. Then there was obviously Carl Ross, Greta, and Sophie. They all tried to help in some kind of a way, whether it was viewed as help or not. They did at least try to do something.
Yeah, they did something. I'll go on that,
yeah. And I haven't mentioned him yet, but there was also Joseph Fink, who was an elevator operator, who was literally right in front of the attack.
Oh, wow. So he, seen it? He was right?
He witnessed the whole thing, including after Mosley fled and Kitty was on the ground begging for help. He watched that whole thing play out as well.
So he knew when the dude left?
Oh, he was literally right there.
And
it happened directly in front of the building he was running the elevator for.
Wow, okay.
But he didn't want to get involved, so he didn't. He claimed to have just walked away and went to the basement to get, I think I read it was either water or coffee. And he wasn't even immediately forthcoming with that information either. He would have to be forced to admit to seeing anything at all. He was even forced to tell the cops his name.
So after him seeing all that, he just decides to
deny. He was
I'm just.
Yep. He was silent.
I'm thirsty. I'm gonna go get water or a coffee. I didn't see what I just seen type thing.
Yep.
Wow.
He just walked away. Okay, which again, another part of this that I haven't gotten to yet or said yet, which I'll go ahead and say now, but you'll hear me say it again later. But to help kind of not make sense out of what's going on so far in the case, but just to kind of level out the facts of it, a lot of the people who lived in these apartments, keep in mind there was a war going on too, and the Depression had just happened, and there was a lot of things going on economically at this time. A lot of the people living there were refugees from other countries. For example, Joseph Fink, I think I read that he was actually a German immigrant who had come over and was living in the apartments, working as an elevator operator. And people who had seen war and had seen death and destruction and had also seen police brutality and chaos and, lived a life filled with things that they had to turn a blind eye to for their own safety. So I'm not justifying it in any way whatsoever at all. Right. I'm not giving any kind of an excuse for anybody. I'm just saying that I think it's also important to take into consideration who the people were that were involved in witnessing this event.
It kind of makes you understand why they
may have been hesitant to get involved.
Okay. See, that makes sense of why.
Some of them, don't get me wrong, some of them were New Yorkers. They were born and raised, and that's who they were. Yeah. But some of them weren't. Some of them were people who weren't even from this country.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I lost my place. Okay. So he wasn't immediately forthcoming with that or his name. He was kind of forced to do so, and by forced, I mean he was taken to the precinct, and he and the police kind of got into a time standoff. He wasn't going to say anything until he realized that the cops were more than willing to wait out his stubbornness. They were going to let him sit there for however long it took. And that's when he spoke up. He, out of all the witnesses, was actually the one in the best position to help. and simply chose not to.
Mm.
Between the people who saw the incident unfold and those who heard the attack taking place, the amount of witnesses just kept going up, it seemed. Not just witnesses of the attack, but also witnesses of Mosley as well as his white Cadillac. They saw his car parked at the train station, they saw it when he drove it away from the first attack, and they saw it when he fled from the scene. Several people gave the police a description of Mosley's vehicle and Mosley. In fact, as Mosley was leaving the scene, he even stopped next to a car that was stalled on the side of the road with someone sleeping in it to warn the driver of how unsafe it was to be sleeping out there. The man even thanked him for his concern of his safety. Of course, this man had no clue Mosley was fleeing a murder scene at the time, but still, this is just an example of how brazen Mosley was being.
That's awfully nice of him.
The police also couldn't believe how many witnesses gave essentially the exact same details. Usually, when you have multiple witnesses, the retellings tend to kind of differ in details, but this time, they didn't differ really at all.
Huh. Interesting.
The police wouldn't have to investigate for long. On March 18th, 1964, so 5 days later, I believe, Mosley would attempt to rob a home. He would be picked up under suspected robbery. He tried to rob this house in broad daylight in a very popular area, and he didn't even try to disguise himself at all.
Smart.
Yeah. When a neighbor approached to ask him what he was doing, he tried to assure the man that he was helping the occupants of the house move.
Oh, yeah, I bet he was.
After verifying with another neighbor that that simply could not be true, the man phoned the police. Luckily, when Mosley tried to get in his car and leave, it wouldn't start,
Oh, that's good.
leaving time for two patrolmen, Daniel Dunn and Pete Williamson, to get there and arrest him. He would be taken to the precinct where he would be questioned by Detective John Tartaglia. Once he got to the precinct about the burglaries and did I say that weird? Burglaries.
That's right.
And Mosley, why do I feel like I'm saying things weird?
I don't know.
I felt like I said that like burglaries. Did I not say it that way?
No, I thought you
I'm
said
sorry.
burglaries,
I'm not trying to interrupt this case at all. I'm just trying to make sure I'm speaking correctly because I feel like I'm not. Okay. Once he was being questioned about the burglaries, and Mosley would go on to confess that the house he was caught robbing was actually the second house he had robbed that day. He would also admit that he had robbed anywhere from 35 to 40 houses over the last year.
Dang.
In fact, what he would admit about the burglaries was that he had been stealing TVs from these houses and taking them to his father's shop, who would then sell the TVs. Now, let it be known for the record, his father, Alfonso Mosley, was completely unaware of what his son had been doing.
Okay, so I was just about to ask.
He had no idea that that's what he was doing. But nonetheless, they took Winston to the shop where he pointed out what TVs were stolen, and they had no choice but to arrest Alfonso for receipt of stolen goods.
Oh, no, but he didn't know.
Doesn't matter, he accepted them. Once Winston was back at the precinct, Detective Tartaglia continued to question him about the burglaries. The fact that Mosley had been so open, honest, and calm throughout the whole process so far made the detective that much more suspicious. Here before him was a man with no previous record, who owned a home, had a wife and kids, had more than enough money, and had no real motive to commit any crimes at all, yet he was doing so in a very nonchalant manner. This prompted the detective to ask if he had committed any other crimes that they should know about. Any of the violent nature, per se. He wasn't immediately as eager to answer this question as he had been the other ones so far.
Okay.
But Mosley almost perfectly fit the description of a perpetrator who had been described by several women who had recently been attacked in the areas of where Mosley had just admitted he'd been robbing. His car also matched the description of the one detectives were looking for in a homicide in Kew Gardens.
Okay.
To get him to confess, the detective asked him about a particular incident that had happened in Jackson Heights, where a man jumped into a car and put a gun to a woman and threatened to shoot her. To this question, Mosley simply responded, quote, "I guess I did do that," end quote.
I guess I did do that.
Mm-hmm. Mosley would go on to confess to 2 more attacks and then 2 more after that. Once that happened, the detectives relayed the information to the main detectives that were working Kitty's case, and they too came in to question Mosley. Their names were Jerry Burns, as mentioned earlier. 2 of the other ones were Mitchell Sang and Bruno Potskis. Another man was named Albert Seidman, who came in to question Mosley as well. He was a commander of several squads in Queens. 6 detectives quickly surrounded Mosley. When the detectives began to debate where the cuts on Winston's hands had come from, he broke and told detectives, "Okay, I killed her." After going into great detail about what he had done to Kitty that night, he would go on to confess to 2 other murders.
Oh, wow.
He told them he murdered a woman by the name of Annie Mae Johnson, who was 24 at the time of her attack. He did this on March 1st, 1964, so a little less than 2 weeks before he attacked Kitty on March 13th. The next murder he would confess to was that of Barbara Kralik. She was only 15 years old at the time of her attack, and she was attacked in her own bed on July 20th, 1963.
Oh my gosh, that poor baby.
Her case was a little more complicated because they actually already had someone waiting to stand trial for her death, Alvin Mitchell, who had already confessed to the attack. So that one was going to be a little harder to charge him with.
Right.
They had to first prove it was Mosley and not Mitchell, but they would end up being able to do that, and they would go on to charge him with the murder of Kenny Genovese, Anne Marie Johnson, and ultimately Barbara Kralik. He was also charged with possession of a firearm and pornography.
Was he not allowed to have pornography back in the day?
That was illegal at that time.
Oh, wow. Did not know that.
Mosley would go on to be given the death sentence on June 1st, 1967. However, under the claim that the original trial made an error by not allowing testimony regarding Mosley's mental health to be used, his sentence would be reduced from death to only 20 years to life. And there was also the fact that in 1965, New York State got rid of the death penalty altogether, so it would have been redacted either way.
Right. Okay.
Mosley was also transferred to a different prison once his sentence was changed. He was moved to Attica Prison, which was a maximum security prison in New York State. Thinking on his feet, he would go on to escape prison in 1968.
How did he manage to do that?
Well, he managed to do that after being taken to the hospital for a self-inflicted injury that he knew wouldn't be able to be treated in the prison, so he would have to be taken to the hospital for.
Oh, wow, okay.
Anybody wants to know any details about what that self-inflicted injury was, feel free to go look it up. I did not put it in this case. When he was about to be transferred back to the prison in the hospital lobby, he assaulted the corrections officer who was with him, Officer Herman Spencer, and fled the hospital. The officer tried to stop him by shooting at him, but he missed, and he was unable to stop him, and Mosley got away. After launching a giant manhunt, Mosley would be recaptured after holding a couple hostage in Buffalo, New York, fleeing in their car, and getting lost because he didn't know his way around New York, holding some more people hostage, a housewife and her friend, as well as the housewife's infant daughter.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Golly.
Once all that took place and the FBI were finally able to get him out of the house, he would receive an additional 15 years for this stunt.
Good.
He would continue to appeal his charges almost all the way up until he died. He would live until he was 81, and he died on March 28th, 2016 in prison.
Wow. Not not that long ago.
It's not.
Did he die of natural causes? Did he die of natural causes, or?
I thought he was such a piece of shit I didn't even bother to look.
Okay. Hey.
I didn't even bother to include. I hope not. I hope it was something horrific and long and painful and just horrible. As horrible as her death was, and despite the fact that the killer confessed and there was, I guess in some form of a way, justice in this case, that's not actually what makes this case so well known and unique. The reason this case would end up being one of the most well-known cases in New York City at the time, it had more to do with the media surrounding it than the actual crime itself.
Okay.
Initially, Kitty's attack didn't receive much attention. The New York Times had ran an article on March 14, 1964, with the headline, "Queens Woman is Stabbed to Death in Front of Home." The article was short and didn't really give much information. The New York Daily News ran an article as well. Their headline was, "Queens Barmaid Stabbed Dies." This article gave a little more information, and this one included some of what was reported that Kitty had been yelling, where the Times article didn't give any of that information. And this article also included her wounds and a little bit more about her life in general. As for articles about Kitty, perhaps the most detailed and informed was the article written by one Edward Wayland. His article's headline was, "Kitty worshipped life in the city and died in its lonely streets."
Oh.
Wayland would go above and beyond in this article. It was published in some of the smaller papers around New York. He had interviews from people who knew her personally, co-workers, and included an interview with one of her brothers.
Wow.
He really tried to shed some light on who Kitty was as a person and the callousness in the way that she died. That was just one of the several articles that he would write about Kitty. The articles began to slowly take traction over time, but not necessarily, again, because of Kitty's death per se, but more about the amount of witnesses there was claimed to be.
Right.
This was in a fairly upscale neighborhood, known for everyone looking out for one another for the most part, so it kind of presented the questions of what was the reason that so many people would stand by and do nothing to assist.
Right.
Therefore, the focus then became, how could so many people hear and know something so awful was taking place and seemingly do next to nothing to stop it or help it all?
Right.
On March 27th, 1964, Martin Gansberg would release his article discussing Kitty's attack in New York Times, and his headline would read, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police."
37?
He also put another line under which read, "Apathy at stabbing of Queens woman shocks inspectors." And then the first paragraph of that article started with him claiming, "For more than a half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens."
3.
He claimed there to be 3. He claimed that he was convinced that Mosley had actually fled twice and come back.
Okay.
On 2 separate occasions, plus the initial attack.
Okay.
And I will say, and I'm going to get a little bit more into that as I keep reading, but I will say, out of everybody who reported anything about this case at all, and anybody who really did the work outside of the police and the detectives and the homicide detectives, anybody law enforcement that had anything to do with this case, Martin Gansberg really did go far beyond what he needed to as a reporter. He really had sympathy for Kitty and her case and her situation, and he was genuinely invested in getting her any kind of justice that he could, and really figuring out what happened in this case and why it played out the way that it did.
That's good. Somebody needs to.
Yeah, in fact, somebody else tried to steal credit for his work later in a way, but I'm not going to mention them nor give them any credit because I just don't think they deserve it. I think they tried to steal his work, and so did he. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and credit Gainsberg's work for being really what forged this forward in the direction that it ends up going.
Okay.
On his work and his writings and his investigations, because he didn't just go to the police station like most of the reporters did and then hear what the detective has to say and then create an article based on that. He didn't do that.
Right.
He physically went to Kew Gardens and he personally interviewed as many of these people as he could. And he heard firsthand their accounts of what they saw, what they heard, what they did, what they didn't do. Like, he really did his due diligence and put in the work to make sure that everything he printed and did was as honest and forthright as it could be.
Okay, that's good.
So I will give him credit for that, even though, despite the credit that he does end up getting in the long run, he didn't want any of that credit. That's not why he did it.
Right.
But ultimately, I do think he deserves the credit that he did get. So after that article, it would later be claimed that the number, or tried to be claimed that the number that he put in that article of the 38 was over-exaggerated, but Gainsbourg stood by the fact that it was that number because he personally had gone to Kew Gardens and interviewed those people, and that number was accurate.
Okay.
Either way, the point of the article was the same.
Right.
Whether it was 38 people or 20 people, that's too many damn people to stand by and watch something so horrific take place and do nothing.
I agree.
Sorry.
No, yeah. I completely agree.
This point of fact obviously drew intense focus on the case and would go on to make the case national news, making headlines all over. It begged the question or debate of how much should a bystander intervene in this type of situation, or whether or not they should intervene at all. It also brought forth a question of morality. Like, I often, especially in the inner cities, even to this day, people will turn their heads or a blind eye to blatant crimes happening right in front of them due to fear of getting involved. I mean, it's very much still happening to this day. This story brought traction for years to come, and the information began to get bigger and more aggressive over the years, painting the Kew Gardens community as enemies of Kitty and evil and calling them cowards. And to that point, the people of Kew Gardens who claimed to witness the attacks, not all of them, but some of them, who were getting very angry about how they were being portrayed, didn't help themselves much or do anything for their characters at all, because they started making some pretty out-of-color comments suggesting that she got what she deserved for being a woman out alone at that time of night.
See, it shouldn't matter. If you're a woman, you should be able to go wherever, whenever, do whatever you want to. Sorry, you're not hearing that. It shouldn't matter if you're a woman or not. So if it was a dude, then, oh man, that'd be just terrible because he was a guy.
Exactly right. And so, you can see here, like, my next line I even put, like, the opinions, they're very disrespectful comments. A person is a person no matter their gender. But it was the 60s, and this sadly was a common mindset in the 60s.
That's true.
Women still didn't have a whole lot of rights at that point in time. Not justifying it. It's horrible, it's awful, it's disrespectful. It should never have existed. But it did. The fact that human beings were basically able to, for lack of better words, stand idly by and let something like this take place and do as little as they did to stop it completely stumped psychologists, as well as experts in human behavior. Kitty's case wasn't the first of this kind of human behavior either. There were other examples of it, such as a fire that happened in Harlem and no one pulled an alarm, despite there being several onlookers to the fire. People being beaten in public, in daylight, on subways, on streets, in front of crowds of people, and no one trying to help. Countless cases where there were many people witness to a crime who chose not to get involved for one reason or another.
Wow. It's sad to think about that, too.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. This is what initiated a vast amount of research into the psychology of it. A man named Harold, he's a professor, his name was Harold Takushian. I hope I said that right. Takushian. who had heard the Kitty Genovese case, began performing studies in the 1980s to see how many people would jump in an emergency situation. One study showed that 100 of 300 did not attempt to do anything.
Now, sorry to interrupt, but I've seen, like, I've seen it on TikTok, I think, that there is I can't remember their name, but they'll do, like, videos like this of, like, a guy walking down the street, and there's, like, a kid right beside him, and he'll, like, grab the kid and run down an aisle.
Yeah, and see if anybody tries to stop him.
People will just be, like, on their phone. Just walk away, and it's just, like, seriously, like, oh.
Yeah.
Like, one out of all the people that he did it to actually did something about it.
And most people, you would be surprised. I'm not going to say most people, but you would be surprised how high the number of people who won't jump in these kinds of situations really is.
It's sad. It really is.
Yeah, it is. Like you said, you can go watch videos right now that gives you perfect examples of these types of situations and studies being done. And I mean, I hate to say it, but more often than not, people will disappoint you. But it's easy to say sitting here. I've never been put in that situation to know what I would hope to God that I would do whatever it takes to save whoever.
Yeah,
and do what I can to help. But again, I've never been put in that situation to know for sure how I would react or handle it. So Professor Takushian, I'm going to say it both ways because I don't know which way is right. He would go on to perform many more studies throughout the years, examining a person's response in situations that begged the question of whether someone would step in or report what was happening. He would be astonished and disappointed at just how many people in these studies would choose to not intervene, or in some, they would even involve children to report the incident to the authorities instead of going to do it themselves. In 1984, Professor Takushian would hold a conference which he co-hosted with a professor at Fordham. His name was Peter J. O'Connor. And they called this conference the Catherine Genovese Memorial Conference. It was held at Fordham University, and in attendance was more than 100 specialists of psychology and law, as well as government officials. One of the persons in attendance was C. Everett Koop, who was the Surgeon General for the United States at the time, who brought forth the legislation that would legally hold bystanders accountable if they did not assist a victim in an emergency situation. This was where the Good Samaritan Laws that Kitty's case inspired came into play. This was also the beginning of many more conferences that would be held in Kitty's name. They're still holding conferences in Kitty's name at this place to this day.
That's awesome.
So another thing to go over is that she inspired was the psychologists coming up with the Bystander Effect, which is sometimes referred to as Genovese Syndrome. So what this phenomenon refers to is the idea that people are more likely to help when they are alone rather than if other people are present. And this was brought forth in 1968 by Bib Latan and John Darley. Basically, this is what they would call someone standing by and not intervening in an emergency situation. It was cited as being developed based on 3 ideas of what might cause someone to not intervene, which would be their development of the syndrome was based on a study. Their development of the syndrome, was based on a study they performed where they had someone emulate someone choking, and 85% of the participants who thought they were alone jumped in to help. As they began adding people to the room, simulating the same situation, less and less people would come forward to aid the victim.
Okay, so it's kind of like if you're alone, you're the only person that can do anything.
Correct.
But there's other people, you're sitting there thinking, well, somebody else will jump in and they'll do it.
Correct. Exactly right.
Okay.
This theory has been proven true more and more over the years, with countless examples of people not jumping in to help when in a crowd. Excuse me. This has even been proven true through social media, as you were just saying. For example, there was an instance of someone threatening to unalive themselves on social media. They had almost 2,000 friends on their page, and no one stepped in to help her or try to stop her. So the idea is that people have the ability to rationalize not stepping in to help by either feeling less responsible the more with the more people that are present, or having a fear of getting involved or being judged, or just simply the idea that people tend to go with the flow. Um, they tend to just go with what they think everyone else is thinking.
That's true. Sad but true.
That they'll even like they even will think to themselves, as we seen in Kitty's case, that someone else has already reached out for help, or I don't know this person, or the thought of if I intervene, will I get hurt? Um, so that's kind of the idea behind the Genovese syndrome, and or the bystander effect, and it's very much still true, and it can still very much be seen to this day.
Yep. Unfortunately.
It is very unfortunate. Another thing said to have been developed because of Kitty's murder, the 911 system was adapted nationwide.
Oh, wow.
At the time of her passing, in order to receive help, a person had to dial 0 to get a hold of an operator or police officer who would relay the call to a communication bureau, who would then pass the call to a police precinct.
Okay.
It had to go through 3 different lines of communication before actually reaching police. Um, whereas with 911, it's a direct line to help. I also read that each individual precinct or area had its own line for this system, but they only had one line. So if more than one person was trying to call that at that time, you weren't getting through.
You would get a busy signal.
You would get a busy signal, and you would just have to keep trying and trying and trying until it wasn't busy anymore.
Man, that would be terrible. Can you think of today if you try to call 911 and it was busy?
No, I couldn't even imagine.
I would just assume that the world is something's going on.
Yeah, correct.
Oh, man, that's scary.
It's said that Gansberg's research and an article he had written about the importance of being able to get a hold of assistance in emergencies quicker, coupled with his article about Kitty in its great detail, helped bring attention to the need for a more prominent way to get contact with police. On July 1st, 1968, New York implemented their 911 system, and it quickly became a national system.
Well, that's good that they were able to do that, but it's sad that it took something like that in order for it to happen.
It is really sad, and I'm not even sure that if Ginsberg hadn't done what he did and written the things that he wrote and stayed so adamant, he really advocated for this case and for Kitty and the whole situation. He advocated for that until he died. I think I seen he died in 1995. But he really stood right by everything that he wrote, and continued to stay focused on this pretty much the rest of his life.
That's awesome.
I will say, though, that I did also read that a lot more of the people said to have witnessed this crime, they actually did call police that night, but I think I read it was 17 of the people actually did call the police that night. But their calls were all concluded by police to be the reporting of either domestic dispute or bar brawl. But I also read that some of the residents at Kew Gardens started denying that the crime had taken place there at all.
Oh.
You guys can form your own opinion about that one. In the early 2000s, the story started being painted as grossly over-exaggerated and falsities, claiming the agenda to be an attempt to tarnish the name of the neighborhood, backed by conspiracies against the refugees who had lived there at the time.
But if the people were interviewed and they said, I didn't do anything.
Exactly right. This whole thing, this whole conspiracy idea and whatnot in the 2000s all started from one article that was trying to disprove the amount of witnesses that had actually been there that night.
Okay.
And when that happened, I'm not going to give the names of which detectives did it, but a couple of the detectives even stepped in and agreed that there was a gross over-exaggeration of the amount of witnesses that Gansberg had claimed to have been present that night. And that, again, just like most of these stories and articles do, it got picked up and they just kind of ran with it. So it went from it, being an accusation of exaggeration to, oh, here's an opportunity for us to repaint Kew Gardens in a better light and give back its good name. So let's take advantage of this opportunity and run with it and just erase this crime from our neighborhood altogether.
Okay. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity of advantage at that point.
But I mean, it happened. So
it happened. It absolutely happened. There's no denying that it happened. It happened.
Yeah.
But that is the very, albeit very tragic case of Kitty Genovese. It's horrific and terrible, but I will say that, a couple of really good things did come out of it.
Yeah,
I don't want to say that in an insensitive way, but you can't even imagine the amount of lives that 911 have saved.
That's true. That's
so,
very true.
I mean, depending on how you look at it, I mean, you could really say that you can't even imagine how many lives that her death has saved. So, if there is a way to do a positive spin on it, that would be my takeaway from it.
Right. I agree. Because, I mean, like I said, if it wouldn't have played out the way that it played out, I mean, it could have been years before it, 911 came in, and, a lot of other people, may have not had the opportunity to get the help they needed as quickly.
Right. So. But, yeah, I agree.
It's just terrible.
It's sad all the way around.
I still can't believe them people. I mean, even though they, some of them, I understand, are immigrants and maybe they were afraid to, try, get involved in anything because they may get in trouble or maybe they weren't there legal. I don't really know the situation, but still, I mean, if, especially that one dude, Carl, I mean, he jumped the roof and he was in somebody else's apartment, right? So there's two people. Was it just them two, or was there somebody else in the apartment too?
So Kitty and Marianne?
No,
or the apartment
Carl
he jumped into?
Yeah.
Oh, no, it was just her at the time.
Okay, so it's just him and her.
At the first apartment that he went into, yeah.
I just still think somebody...
Now, I did read in some resources, not that this matters or not, but it may play into him, making that comment at the end about, I think she's drunk or whatever. I did also read in some resources that Carl himself was drunk that night. And so that may have played a role in him not having a clear head on how to react or what to do, coupled with his lifestyle choices at the time, playing a fear role. I mean, those things, if that was true, those things could have coupled in as well. But, despite him not necessarily taking what we might deem the appropriate steps, he should have just called the police from the jump. I think we can all agree with that.
Right.
But I will say, out of all the people who did witness in here, whatever they witnessed in her, at least he tried to do something.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I really wish that freaking door guy or elevator dude, he should have done something.
Joseph Fink.
As soon as he seen that dude leave, he could have found a phone.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I'm sure there's a phone in that apartment, in the office or in the basement somewhere.
Well, and if you remember correctly, that first attack that took place was on Austin Street and Lefort Boulevard, or I think, is it Lefort Boulevard? I think is what it was. But the police box that the other lady mentions when she asks her husband if she can run down to go to the police box,
right.
It was right there.
Right.
Like, it was at the intersection where the attack takes place, which I know at some point, in the case I mentioned that maybe Kitty was trying to get to the bar and grill on Austin Street, but she also may have been trying to get to the police box, which was located there as well.
That's very true. Yeah.
So, the only thing that makes me think maybe she wasn't trying to get to the police box is because when he did flee and she did get up, instead of continuing to go to the police box, she opted to retreat back towards her apartment.
Around,
Correct. That's the only reason that I put it in the way that I did, is because I was like, well, maybe she wasn't trying to get to the police box. Maybe she's just trying to find people.
Right, yeah. That'd probably be your first, thought, is to try to find somebody
that
can help you instead of, thinking of like, oh, well, there's a call box over here. No, you're like,
Right.
I need contact. So yeah, I can understand that.
But yeah, that was my case. So as
It
always,
was really good. I've never heard of it. It was sad. It was really good.
thank you. I also had never heard of it, which I was really surprised by. Especially with, like I said, her case kind of being the whole reason that we have 911, which, like I said before, it saved who knows how many lives. Like, you'd think that her case would be super well known and out there, and maybe it is, and I just haven't been paying attention to the right avenues.
Right.
But I personally had never heard of it. I thought it was an interesting case, and I thought that it deserved to be told and heard. So, speaking of being heard, thank you guys for listening and watching and joining us in the episode. I'm sorry it was so long. I just wanted to make sure I did this. It was, but I wanted to make sure that I did this case as much justice as possible and made sure I put in as many facts as I could. So, my next one won't be so long, I promise. Hopefully, you stuck through to the end. But, yeah. We are
Render the darkness.
Bye.